Welcome to Learning React with me. In this video, we are going to see how to use state in functional components. I'm going to use the same example which I used in the class-based components, where we displayed the list of users and updated the state with the selected user ID and name. We can convert this class component into a functional component, but the problem is we cannot access state inside a functional component. Usually, functional components are known as stateless components, since traditional functional components didn't have the ability to maintain state. With React 16.8, hooks were introduced to let us use state and other features without using class components. Let's try to see how we can modify this class component to a functional component and replicate the exact same functionality using hooks instead of state. Let's remove this class and make it a functional component using arrow function. Let me import the hook useState. So what is this hook now? So hook is a special function that lets us access React features which were traditionally available only in class components. And now we can use all those features in functional components using hooks. All hooks start with the prefix use, since we are literally making use of the state using useState. Similarly, we have many hooks like useEffect, useContext, etc. Let's focus only on useState in this video. We don't need any constructor in the functional component, so we can remove this code. But before that, let's try to initialize state using useState hook. So in order to do that, you have to call the useState method passing an initial value. For now, let's take just a single property selected user ID, and the initial value for this property would be 0. So I'm passing the initial value to the useState hook. Unlike class components, state need not be an object every time. It can be an integer, string, array, or an object based on the properties that you are going to maintain in this component. This useState hook returns two values. One, the current state, and the other, a function to update the state. So let's capture those two values in two variables. I'll name the state as selected user ID and the function to update the state as set selected user ID. These names can be any user defined names, but it's a convention to use the prefix set before this function name. If you're confused about this syntax, let me show you some other code. Let me store this useState function in a variable. And this useState will return two values that will be stored in state, of course in the form of an array. So in order to access those two values, let me take the variable as current state, and that is available at the index 0. And let me take another variable set state, which has the pointer to the function that updates the state, and that is available in index 1. So every time using the indices and accessing these two values would be a bit confusing. So JavaScript has provided array destructuring, which is nothing but this syntax which we have seen earlier. So this would be neat and easy to understand, and we have less number of lines of code. If you want to maintain another property in the state, you can follow the same method and assign selected username and set selected username to useState with an initial value of empty string, since we're not selecting any user in the beginning, and hence it will have a empty string and ID will be assigned to 0. Otherwise, instead of maintaining multiple useState hooks, you can simply maintain an object which has both these properties. For example, let me copy this and paste it here. Instead of saying selected username, I'll just say selected user, and the function would be set selected user. And now I'll assign an object, and my object will have properties selected user ID with an initial value of 0 and selected username with an initial value of empty string. So these two lines of code is now one line of code which has an object with initial values in the useState. So now I can remove these two lines, also this constructor. So to access these state values, let's go to the in functional component. We don't have any render method, so let me remove it. Inside the return statement, let me print this. So in order to access this state, you can directly use this variable selected user. So this selected user represents our state now, and this would remain the same except for this keyword. This dot state is also not required now, and instead of selected user ID, it would be selected user dot this property selected user ID. And once it is matching with the current user, we are assigning a different class called container selected. If it doesn't match, it would be a regular container class. Let me save this and move to the browser. We see an error. This is because the component itself is a function, and we cannot define another function inside of the function like this. We need to use arrow functions. So let me update this to an arrow function which receives an input called user, and inside functional components we don't have access to this keyword, so let's remove this. Instead of set state, we have another method called set selected user to update the state. Let me replace it, and this is the object I want to update. Selected user ID will be assigned to user.id, selected username will be assigned to user.name. This would remain the same. And useState will not support a callback function. Let me remove this and save it. Let's move to the browser. So we have our component available. Let me refresh this. Initially, the state is assigned to 0 and name is assigned to empty string. Once I click on any of this user, the state will be updated as usual. So John, ID is 3, name is John, and since we have assigned another class called selected whenever this state ID matches with the current user ID, so that's why we see a different border when compared to the other users in this list. Similarly, when I click on other users, they will be updated accordingly. So this is how we use state in functional components. Thank you for watching. Please like, share and subscribe to InterviewPro.